The film The Railway Man, which comes out on Friday, tells the story of Eric Lomax, who was taken prisoner of war by the Japanese and forced to work on the notorious Thai-Burma Railway. Here's a scene which gives a sense of his experiences in the camp. He's being accused of using a radio to communicate with the local resistance.
You used this to communicate with Thai resistance and their Chinese paymasters?
No, I didn't. How could I do that?
You received information and passed it on to them with this.
How could I do that?
I am asking the questions, you must answer them.
But it's a receiver. It receives signals. It doesn't transmit them. How can you transmit with a receiver?
You built this transmitter to tell the Chinese about our railway.
Well, Lomax, who died in 2012, was, unsurprisingly, haunted by what he went through, but he eventually managed to come to terms with the past and wrote a memoir about it. He even formed a friendship with the Japanese officer you heard interrogating him there. And the film's themes are reflected in another recently published diary by a prisoner on the railway. Eric Cordingly was a chaplain to the prisoners. He went on to become an Anglican bishop. He kept notes and a diary during his time in captivity, and in October his children brought them out as a book under the title Down to Bedrock. His daughter, Louise Reynolds, told me he was reticent both about his experiences and the importance of his faith.
He was a parish priest. He became a bishop. And he didn't talk about his faith, you just knew he had it, but he wore it very lightly. We knew there'd been these experiences as a prisoner of war, but I think probably they were so awful that they didn't want to revisit them.
He did, in the end, talk to Anglia.
He did, yes.
Let's just hear what he said about what I think he described as the worst part of the experience.
I think the hardest job for me was the dreadfulness of being up on the railway and having hundreds of men desperately, or thousands of men, 3,000 of them, and having to be present or wanting to be present at the death of each one of them, as I tried to be, and then taking them out afterwards and burying perhaps 20 or 30 of these starved, sick men who had died, mostly in my presence.
Talks about it very calmly, but that's the most harrowing account.
In his notes, because we discovered his notes, he talks even more about it and how harrowing it was to see them, sometimes with just a spoon, a haversack and a piece of rag, just lying on a bare bamboo. And sometimes their exhaustion was so complete that they actually, no pain was suffered, they slipped into a coma, and the end was very peaceful. And in the morning they would discover several bodies lying still. I mean, that's such an awful picture, but that's what was going on.
Must have been quite shocking for you when you read the diaries, wasn't it?
Well, it was, especially because this was written at the time. It was an eyewitness account written by someone who didn't know if he'd live or die himself. So it's very vivid, comes off the page. You almost feel you're there with him.
A lot of people who went through that experience on the railway, and indeed in Japanese prisoners of war camps more generally, came away feeling angry and bitter and full of hatred. And indeed Eric Lomax, the hero of the film that's about to come out, was among them until he went through a sort of transformation. But your father, I think, didn't. Let's just hear what he had to say about the subject of feeling bitter when he gave that interview.
No, I never have. In fact, today I can't understand how it is that people can be so brutal and violent to each other. And I don't think even in the grimmest times up on the railway did I ever feel any sense of hatred towards the Japanese or those who are our captors.
That's quite extraordinary, and a lot of people who had family members who were among the prisoners, I suspect, will find it extraordinary listening to that.
Yes, he talked about being very real. Everything was very real. They'd all been so close to death that life became very real and utterly sincere. And I think perhaps they saw each other as real. Maybe they saw the Japanese as real people too. That's the only way I can make sense of that.
But having been through the sorts of things that we've just been talking about, to come out of that without feeling any sort of negative feelings towards those responsible is remarkable.
Well, he did say that one of the things which died in the prison camp was hate. He said we'd lost during those years the feeling to hate the Japanese. And he remembers especially the arrival of the paratroopers at the end who came to release them, how brutal they were with their Japanese guards. And they felt this was, rather horrifying because they felt that the life in the camp was the real life, the life which bore witness to what really counted, the spirit, he writes. So In other words, the people who were coming to rescue them became the outsiders.
You said earlier that he wore his faith lightly, and
Yes.
it wasn't something he talked about very much. But from the sound of it, the experience of those years had a profound influence on the nature of that faith.
I think so, and he said afterwards he didn't like any kind of religious bigotry. He just felt he had no time for that. There was no humbug or cant, he said, where they were, but the men were no longer shy about religion, and they knew how to experience the joy of their faith.
You brought the book out in October.
I did.
What do you hope it will achieve, and what do you hope people will take away from it?
Well, they do call those poor prisoners of war, 50,000 Allied prisoners of war, the Forgotten Army. And I think it's time, as the Railwayman film has come out, for people to know a bit more about what did go on there.
Why do you think that's important?
Well, it was such a horrific experience, and it's extraordinary that the ones who did survive came through actually as stronger people. And certainly for my father, I think his faith was strengthened.
Have you at all got a sense of the impact he had on the lives of those he was serving as a chaplain?
Oh, I think he had a huge influence on them, because he'd felt a bit in the way in the army, but then when they had to surrender, he suddenly had a job to do. And so he found a little ex-mosque and converted it into a church. It became a centre of activities. And I think for a lot of people, it deepened their faith and gave them some comfort and structure in a life where there was no structure at all. In fact, I got a letter from one of them, and this is what he said. I remember St George's Church and was found in there at every chance I had. Each night I would make tracts to sit in silent prayer and sometimes have a chat to a chaplain. Here was when I got to know your dear father, who provided comfort to me because I wasn't feeling worth much and left in a far part of the world with no chance of seeing my family again. I was attending the daily funerals and thinking, who next? Is it me? But through the prayers and services and your dad's sermons, I rebuilt my life and felt a trust that all would be fine.
Louise Reynolds talking to me